Proceedings are resumed. I call on the honorable member from East End for the continuation of the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we took the luncheon break, in debating this regulation of the fuel market in the Cayman Islands, I was talking about what I consider a regulation of the market. Now, Mr. Speaker, there may be some who would consider what I'm saying the nuclear option, as the minister said that was the final option that the government would have. I do not believe the regulation of a fuel market is a nuclear option. I believe it is necessary to avoid the uncertainty that we have seen in the fuel prices in the country. Mr. Speaker, each and every one of us know that we see such unreasonable, in our view, fluctuations in this market. We'll hear or we monitor the stock exchange, or we'll hear on reports that world oil price, the bottom has dropped out. And within days or within months, our prices at the gas station goes up. It seems to work in reverse of what the actuality is. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to claim that I have the full authority on this subject. But certainly, Mr. Speaker, the fact that there is no way available to us to manage the expectations of the consumers tells me that we need to start sitting down with these people. And Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I employed when I did the CUC negotiation was two things. First, the consumer needs to be protected and look out for. Two, the company needs to remain viable. I believe those two things are possible. In the interest of fairness to the country and to all concerned. Because it takes too much to bring in another company, and government does not want to be seen as making things so difficult that the companies fail. Mr. Speaker, this bill in Section 3 says, Cabinet shall establish and maintain policies designed to ensure that the importation, exportation, re-export, shipping, transportation, processing, refining, storage, storing, distribution, marketing, and selling of fuels, the operation and activities of fuel sector, and any matters considered by Cabinet to be in the public interest relating to the handling and sale of fuel are carried out in a manner that is consistent with the public interest so as to attain the objectives and purposes set out in subsection 2. Subsection 2 reads, the objectives and purposes referred to in subsection 1 are as follows: to ensure that the islands have a proper, adequate, and continuous supply of fuel, which are obtained under the most economical and competitive terms possible, taking into account all available resources of fuel. B, to ensure that the fuel sector in the islands operates under conditions of orderly, economic, efficient, and fair competition. C, to ensure the provisions of to the public of fuel are reasonable, at reasonable prices, which accord with international price levels, while ensuring that persons in the fuel sector obtain fair and reasonable returns. That's precisely what I just said. Now, Mr. Speaker, here's where I'm at. How do we do that? Mr. Speaker, it escapes me. It may not escape the minister and the government, and the minister's staff, but it surely escapes me how we are going to do that when we do not have a starting point, a benchmark to measure that from. That benchmark needs to be established. If we do not know what it's costing the suppliers, we can't say that it is fair to the consumers. Thus, my argument, I come back to my argument that we need a set of formulas which everybody has agreed upon. One standard value, i.e., Pratt or some form of understanding that can serve as that platform, and then another one that is about that. And the two of those combined will give us the cost of that fuel to this country. Let me explain, Mr. Speaker. If we employ the standard as being the world oil price, we know that's 2 months delayed. We know that is standard. We cannot change that. That is the platform from which we kick off. We know that there needs to be transportation. Added into that, that is CIF Cayman. Oh, that's South Sound. Cost, insurance, and freight. That is added to the world oil price. Those are standard. Many times the transportation costs may fluctuate, but within reason. Mr. Speaker, most transportation costs nowadays is somewhere between 8 and 10 cents per gallon. Why I know that? It just so happened, Mr. Speaker, over the lunch period, I had lunch with one of my good friends. What did he do in his career? He owned ships. See how it works? He is retired for the third time to East End. Kept buying his companies back when they start to fail. But that's not the only reason. Mr. Speaker, when we have established those costs, then we can start looking at the cost to that company to operate in the Cayman Islands. Business license, labor, material, importation, parts, cost, all an integral part of that company's survival. Once we have established that, we can then apply a reasonable profit margin on that company, with the understanding that a number of those parameters will change over time. Cost of doing business is going to change. However, Mr. Speaker, under the RCAM, there are provisions for it. We use the CPI and capture it. That is the Consumer Price Index, which is incorporated as part of the RCAM formula, and that captures that. So when that profit margin has been established, and it goes outside of those parameters, but they have to prove that by virtue of giving up their accounts. Simple. Mr. Speaker, CUC has to do it. They must report every activity to the ERA on a regular basis. And if they feel like they are outside those parameters, which is between 9 and 11, then they will apply for a rate increase. If it is justified, then they will get it. It's approved. If it is not justified, if they go over the top, they have to rebate consumers. So, Mr. Speaker, it is my belief that whilst the minister may be making a gallant effort to try and make the people feel like something is being done to assist them, this does not go far enough. It does not go far enough to ensure that consumers are protected. You can't monitor what you don't know. I mean, Mr. Speaker, even the Minister of Finance can confirm that. If he don't have the numbers coming in, he can't monitor it. If he has no formula, no set of criterias, you can't monitor it. And there is nothing in this bill, not that I have seen. Maybe I have missed it. Maybe I have missed it. Mr. Speaker, what I've also seen in the bill, I am seeing in the bill, is Section 8. Notwithstanding the provisions of any other law, the office, that is the regulation and competitive office, competition office, may access any information that it requires for the carrying out of its functions under this law from any government entity, any person in the fuel sector, or other person whom the office reasonably believes may have access to the information it requires. Oh, Mr. Speaker, let us for a second turn to that section. We have not received it before. Where is the evidence to suggest that putting it in this law we're going to get it? There is no enforcement. We can tell them we want it. Mr. Speaker, I spoke earlier about how we keep hearing, and this is a tactic that most of these people use. They will create an invoice from another company that bought it from the supplier, who bought it from that supplier, and who bought it from that producer. That's how they do it. I know that. The government knows that too, though, you know, Mr. Speaker. If you think they don't know that, they know that. But we cannot sit down and allow them to continue to do it. We will never get any further ahead if we allow them to consistently manufacture their own invoices. The one thing that is common, Mr. Speaker, is the source of that fuel. There are only certain places you can get it from. And they must have record of whom they sold it to. But they're putting it through Timbuktu and through Bahamas and through Jamaica and through Trinidad and through before it reaches us. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, here's what happens. If that fuel is bought from a producer in Louisiana, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. The fuel comes direct here, but the invoices go all over the place. And are created here, there, and everywhere to avoid saying how much they paid for it in Louisiana. Therein lies our problem. Now, the government has the authority. And if they don't, they need to take it. Create it. To say we want the invoice from the point of origin. Because an invoice came out of the point of origin, you know, Mr. Speaker. An invoice came out of there. We cannot be afraid that if we put these things in place, the fuel company is going to leave. Mr. Speaker, this country can find an old retired ship. That's what they do with those. They park them in harbors and use them for storage until you get a company that is prepared to come in under the conditions. We're talking about supply. Yes, that's our responsibility. Mr. Speaker, the only way we are going to protect the consumer in this country is to put systems in place. This bill does not do it. Despite trying to make us say that this is the panacea for the fuel market. It is not. It has no teeth. It has nothing in it except requiring the office to have two eyes. They already had those. They can see the price on each gas station individually and collectively. It is printed every week or something like that in some of the papers. And they put it on their website. What's the good of that? Just to tell you that the one down the road has it 2 cents cheaper than the other one? Mr. Speaker, consumers have to be protected, and the only way they can be protected is to put the mechanisms in place with parameters that are known, that are achievable, that is available. Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, all these things I'm saying are available right on the internet. World oil price is listed right there. We know from month to month, we know from day to day how much it was sold for. There is no rocket science in this. That's how we monitor if they're being fair to the consumer. That's how we do it. We don't ask them to provide the information, we do it ourselves. And if we catch them wanting, there are penal sanctions. There must be. Or people are going to forever get on top of us because they're not protected. And Mr. Speaker, it don't make sense to put penal sanctions in place if you can't have a measure that you can measure it against. That's how you put penal sanctions in place. If you do this, this is how it must be done. If you don't do it in that manner, this is what is going to happen. That's penal sanctions. What I'm trying to do, Mr. Speaker, is ask the minister to somehow let's find some way of doing this. We cannot allow the people to go on forever like this. Some of the industry, the utility industry, let me call it that, Mr. Speaker. Water, we control. We control electrification, electricity. We control telephone. Albeit, I think we need to start doing what my brother used to tell me, tighten up. We need to tighten that up now too. We need to revisit that. But that is somewhat controlled by virtue of competition and market share, so to speak. Mr. Speaker, there's no control on these. Absolutely none. But every other utility has some measure of control. And there are formulas used to arrive at that control. Agreed formulas now. These are all agreed. But these people avoid it. They absolutely avoid it. Mr. Speaker, not only do they do it to the public, the general public, they do it to government because we have to buy fuel from them too, you know. You know the amount of vehicles we have? Mr. Speaker, I submit that the cost of fuel in this country is too high compared with what it is being bought for, transported for, and what should be considered a reasonable profit. Too high. You can't tell me CUC is under $2 for a pass-through diesel delivered to their compound, their plant, and the diesel out on the street is $4 and $4.40, 20 cents, 30 cents. I don't buy diesel out on the street at the gas stations. No one can tell me. So you're telling me it's under $2, around $2 at CUC, and they're not making no profit on it? They're making profit on it. So that tells me, Mr. Speaker, they bought it for much less. Am I that fool? They can't expect us to be that fool, Mr. Speaker. Been in this business too long. Should be considering retiring out of it. Been on the ships. Every day we see crude going down from $50 some dollars to $40 some dollars recently. 2 days later, the price gone up at the gas station. Really? Mr. Speaker, my plea to the minister is we need to bring them, whether it's a round table or a oblong table or square table or no table. Somebody needs to come to a Come to Jesus meeting. This can't go on no longer. Cannot do it. And they say what they may about me. Mr. Speaker, whilst I have a responsibility and a need to ensure the utilities are viable, the companies, I also have a responsibility to the consumers, who just happens to be my people.
Honorable member, you have 1 hour left.
Mr. Speaker, I am not trying to put my good friend, the Minister for Fuels anyhow, for Works, in any uncomfortable position. What I am saying to him is that I'm here, that I am available to help him in this regard. He might need my help. And if such is the case, so much the better. But at the very least, he knows where I stand on this issue. And he knows that he has at least one that will understand him and when he goes to put systems in place. We have been talking about this long enough. The minister said he was going to bring a bill to correct it all when we amended the dangerous substances handling, I think it was. When was this? Oh, the dangerous substances handling and storage law in 2013, 14, 15, something like that, Mr. Speaker. And that was a stopgap. At the time, I didn't like it, and I like it less now. Because this is the end of us. I don't want to give the people at the office here eyes. They have eyes. Utility Regulation and Competition Office. They already have eyes. They are already capable enough to understand what the formulas are and how they should be applied. They have that. Let us give it to them. But the more of these little piece of proper legislation you bring here, the worse it is for consumers. The more we empower them out there, the suppliers, to do what they want. We need to ensure they are providing the necessary information for the office to properly monitor the fuel sector. Mr. Speaker, ordinary people on the street, you think they don't know when it's hurting? They know. And even though they may not understand the fuel market, they understand when the price go from $2 up to $3 in one day, and they never heard anything about the price going up anywhere else in the world. You think they don't? Of course they do. Even the very uninitiated knows that because it's tangible, it's measurable, and it's visible. They know. They can see it. And most of all, they feel it in their pockets. The lack of tangibility in their pocket, and they measure it. They know, Mr. Speaker. At the very least, what the government, the position the government would be put in, and all legislators, is that it would be explainable. You could say that the world oil price rose, and it rose 2 months ago, and it's just taken place now. You could do that if you put the system in place. In the absence of it, we have no reason, no excuses to give our people. None. What we got to tell them, we watching it? They're looking at it too. They got eyes the same way. If we looking at it, oh, everybody got cataract, eh? Or everybody Ray Charles, you hope they're Ray Charles. They're looking at it too. They're feeling it too. That's not good enough. Mr. Minister, I applaud you for your gallant effort. The rest of these laws, Mr. Speaker, all got, they say I didn't do anything good. Huh? Ask them where this word, this thing called RCAM came from. It started in the ERA law. Under whose direction? Man. It is now represented in every other utility law with the exception of the fuel. Why? I don't say using RCAM. I don't say use RCAM. I am saying if there is no better formula, that one is good for this too. That's all I'm saying, Mr. Speaker. But first of all, it has to be a negotiated formula. It has to be an agreed formula by all concerned. People just want to make too much profit at the expense of our people. Our job is to ensure they make a reasonable profit and protect our consumers at the same time. That's all we are responsible for. That's all I want to do. That's what my job is. Don't make legislation which tells our people to keep your eye on them. Keep your eye on them for what? To fall in love? There's no love in this. This is about business. That's what this is about. This is about protecting the consumers. It's about protecting the businesses in a fair and equitable manner. Mr. Speaker, I want to support my good friend, my boy. This little law, as he says, short, but leaves much to be desired, in my view. Everybody can have their own view, but all those years I had in the technical field, this one don't cut it for me. It doesn't cut it for me. It would not happen on my watch. If you want it, you come to the table. If you don't want to come to the table, I go into the chairs down the Legislative Assembly. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Call on the fourth elected member for Bordentown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also wanted to rise and give a contribution to the debate on this bill. And I don't think I have to speak for very long because I think my colleague from East End has summed it up very well, in that we are pleased to see that we're making steps forward to regulate the fuel market. But Mr. Speaker, I too am disappointed that when I read the bill, that I don't see what I would consider the necessary mechanisms in the law that will be created to go further than just monitor. I think, Mr. Speaker, the word collusion has been used here already today in this debate. And I don't think this is speculation anymore. I think, in my opinion, for the most part, everyone understands how this game works. But Mr. Speaker, my main concern clearly has to be for the people of this country who are subjected to a fuel market, fuel prices, which are not just out of their control, but also out of control of the government. And when we think, Mr. Speaker, about the impact that this has on our people, on the economy, on businesses. It is not something that should be underestimated. We hear every day people complain about the cost of living. People complain about not being able to make ends meet. Businesses complain about the high cost of doing business. And Mr. Speaker, fuel plays a role, a significant role in all of that. And I think we're losing an opportunity here if we don't do it now to make a meaningful change. And I'm hoping that the minister will perhaps give his own perspective when he winds up. I know he said he has some other points to talk about when he gets up. But I'm hoping he will expand on why we've sort of held back, because this sort of step-by-step approach, I can understand, especially knowing the minister the way I know him, that he doesn't want to use shock treatment to remedy this issue. And I know he understands the delicate balance, and he understands the possible consequences for going too far with it. But Mr. Speaker, it is, as the member from East End said, I think it is time that we do more than simply monitor, and that we put a law in place that has some teeth. Because I don't think you have to try very hard, Mr. Speaker, to convince the majority of people in this country that fuel prices, the prices we pay for fuel, and that translating into price of goods and services, is something that is a major concern for everyone. And you don't have to try very hard, Mr. Speaker, to convince people that we're not getting a fair deal as far as fuel prices are concerned. So I am concerned that we're not going far enough, and I would like to see this government have the ability to not just monitor and question, but to also take some action, some corrective actions. And I'm Mr. Speaker, I am not an advocate for price controls. I believe in the invisible hand, but in instances where we see obvious collusion and obviously people are taking advantage of the situation that we have generously given them to operate in, the environment they have been given to operate in, I think it really is time for us to take more, not reactive, but proactive measures to ensure that this practice doesn't continue, Mr. Speaker, because as I can't say it often enough, it is having an effect on everybody. It affects everyone. And while we have to maintain that delicate balance between, not over-regulating and not interfering too much in business operations, we also have to protect the consumers, Mr. Speaker. And I looked at the bill and I see in section 10(1)(c)(5), it mentions the cabinet may make regulations for the better carrying out of this law and for giving effect thereto, and in particular the cabinet may make regulations, and it goes on to say, on the recommendation of the office prescribing measures for the protection of consumers. And I understand that this is in there for a purpose, because cabinet can make regulations to protect consumers, but I would like to have seen this put in the law, set in stone, because one of the concerns we hear, and I know all of us have heard it, Mr. Speaker, is that we don't really have the level of consumer protection that most consumers would like to see. Just driving back here, Mr. Speaker, I was a little bit late coming back from the lunch break, and I tried to tune into the broadcast, and I eventually turned the radio, changed the channel, because the broadcast was so patchy and dropping, and that goes on to another area of our economy that we need to address. But again, it was intermittent internet feed, which everybody complains about. But we've seen some steps being taken in telecoms where consumers have a bit more protection now. And I'd like to see a similar approach here, Mr. Speaker, because at least now I can pick up the phone and call and have that issue addressed. But we are lacking in the area of consumer protection. And while I appreciate that no business wants a heavy-handed government standing over them, if businesses operate fairly and respect, I think is the right word, Mr. Speaker, respect the consumers, then there will be no need for it. But until that time comes, Mr. Speaker, I really think that the government has to take the initiative to protect us, protect the consumers. My colleague from East End talked about it's not only the consumers, the private individuals and businesses, it's also the government itself. We have to make sure that these producers, these suppliers understand what they're actually doing to the economy. I won't get into an economics lesson here, Mr. Speaker, out of fear that the Minister of Finance might correct me, but I think we all understand how this can impact and how this is impacting our economy. And in very simple terms, the more people pay due to inflation and increasing prices, the less disposable income they're going to have that can go back into the economy, go into investing in their own endeavors. And it's just a matter of, preserving or ensuring that people have a good standard of living, Mr. Speaker. I have seen where the government has made steps to reduce the duty on fuel in order to deliver some savings, especially for electricity, Mr. Speaker. But the government can't do it all, and the government shouldn't be expected to do it when the private companies involved in this industry are not making the effort. And I really think this is a good effort, but I think it needs to go much further. My colleague from East End talked about the global decrease in fuel prices, and we're just not seeing it here. In other countries around the world that are properly regulated, you see the effect. We visit those countries, and we're shocked when we go to fill up our rental cars at the gas station. We see the comparison between fuel prices between here and there, Mr. Speaker. So I don't think that the government need worry that they won't have support. And I hope that at this juncture we could probably entertain an amendment to this bill to give it a bit more teeth, give it a bit more of an ability to say to these fuel companies, you're not operating fairly, and we're now going to step in and make sure that you do. So I would be happy, Mr. Speaker, to support that sort of legislation. And I think we all would. But I really don't, I'm a bit disappointed because I don't think that this bill goes far enough. And I'm hoping that the minister, when he gets up, will acknowledge that maybe there is something that can be done within the sitting so that we can fix this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the minister's wind-up.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable Fifth Elected Member from Georgetown.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to support the bill, but I also want to echo some of the sentiments about whether or not it goes far enough. I do think that it's a good first step in the right direction. And I know that the minister is passionate about the high cost of fuel. And governments should, in fact, be very cognizant of fuel prices and the effect it has on the economy. And in many ways, we live in a bubble, Mr. Speaker. We say we boast one of the highest GDPs around the world, and we have fees from the various financial structures that are set up here. And I think sometimes some of us can get caught up in this false reality. Because the one thing that affects the majority of us, not talking about the 1%, Mr. Speaker, talking about the hardworking, blue-collar, month-to-month salary earners in the country. One thing that affects all of us are the prices of gas. And if we do not see the falls when they occur, things like consumer spending, jobs, food, education, travel, all these things are affected by the cost of gas in this country. And I've been here now, Mr. Speaker, almost 4 years. May will be here very soon. And throughout these 4 years, I've heard numerous debates in this honorable House about how to get a better handle on the cost of fuel, how to get transparency on the delivered fuel cost here, the source of fuel, and all the components. And I won't go into any of those details that the previous speakers spoke about. But when you look at the functions of the office under this bill, and I hope soon to be law, I do see some space for some more teeth, some more transparency that those hardworking, average Caymanians, and I mean that average in what they take home, can have some sense of fairness and transparency. Mr. Speaker, I just attended a Caribbean energy conference in the Bahamas in January. And the main discussion there, Mr. Speaker, was the variation in gas prices across the Caribbean. Why in some places it was some of the lowest in the world, and in some other places it was some of the highest in the world. And that whole discussion centered around one major theme, and that was information, Mr. Speaker. And I've heard some of the speakers before me talk about that and how we can use our regional counterparts, if we can use one source of data to help inform countries about whether or not they're actually getting the best bang for the buck. Because I think part and parcel of this whole thing, and I know, because the minister has said it before, that part of this exercise is to be able to ascertain some of the information that before this law comes into place is not or has not been readily available, or it's been shrouded in lots of layers. And I do hope for our people that when it's all said and done, that this process, the pains that we've gone through, the added cost of setting up such a regime will in fact give them what they deserve. And that is the clarity on gas prices that they put in their cars, and whether or not they are getting gouged at the pumps. Because that is common water cooler talk, Mr. Speaker. People talk about gas prices a lot. And when people are talking a lot about something, it's because it's important to them, Mr. Speaker. A member from Bordentown spoke about traveling abroad, just as close as Florida, and seeing huge reduction in the fees that for gas, the cost of gas, than we do here. And we always wonder, why is it that they can have gas prices so low, we 400 miles away are so high? And part of this is educating the public, and I hope, again, some of these functions would be to have easily understood breakdowns of the price from source to the price to the pump, letting people understand very clearly where the added costs come in. The refinery costs, the shipping costs, the marketing costs, the that cost and this cost. Because it's when people have information, and I'm not talking about some graph that you would have to have a Harvard degree to decipher, Mr. Speaker. Something that gives our people clarity and that they can put their finger on it and touch it. Mr. Speaker, that's what we as legislators, that's what we as a government need to do. And Mr. Speaker, part and parcel of getting information from these suppliers, when they say, oh, well, this is proprietary information, and this is, something that if we give you and it gets out to our competitors, we're, they're going to use it against us. We've heard the word collusion a number of times in the speakers that have come before. If they can't produce the originating invoices, they can't land fuel. How about something that simple? If you can't get the information, you don't come in. Mr. Speaker, we also need to look at some of the world indices, the ones that our competitors use, the ones that other countries use. You know, when we're looking at the global petrol prices and the Platts oil gram report and those sorts of things, we need to better utilize that information to help our people. And we can't just have a situation where everything is controlled by two parties. They control the retail, they control the commercial. And, Mr. Speaker, this duopoly, hurts our people. It hurts them in the pocketbook. It hurts a number of other things, like some of the ones I mentioned before, because fuel costs in this country affect every single person, either positively or negatively. And that's when it's low, it's positive. When it's too high, it's negative. How do we stop that, Mr. Speaker? That's what I'm hoping this regulation of the fuel market will do. Where we get efficiencies, Mr. Speaker, and where we get some common sense responses to a situation that has existed far too long. If you control the cost, you control the risk. We already have the largest supplier, the largest consumer being CUC. Why can't we try to get some economies of scale where everybody feeds off the CUC pipeline? Control. That's what this is all about, Mr. Speaker. Nobody wants to give up control once they have it, and sometimes you have to pry it out of their cold, dead hands. Because conversation sometimes doesn't result in lower prices and success. We also have to not go down this route where we justify actions that we've allowed to occur for a period of time and say, oh, well, that's the way it is, especially when the laws and the rules say different. Mr. Speaker, these companies were never supposed to control the retail operations. We've let it go. Now an LCCL is a dime a dozen. No one stops anything because of the fees. If we looked at having majority control of the retail, that would be something that would do a lot for our people as well. A true competitive environment where there's no artificial pegging of prices. Mr. Speaker, other people know much better than I do in this room about things like RCAM and formulas, and I think that might shut him up. But saying that, I go back to using relevant data. Because once we know what the world market price is, we know the duties that we pay on getting stuff shipped here, we know the delivery cost. Those are things, Mr. Speaker, that will assist our people. And that's our obligation as a country, to look out for those people and to give them the comfort that someone is looking out for them. Because a lot of this is psychological as well as financial, Mr. Speaker. They elect us so that we can speak for them, so we can stand up for them, and when we know they're hurting, because we hurt with them as well, it's our jobs, no matter how inconvenient that is, no matter how painful that might be, to stand up for them. Mr. Speaker, we need the data. We need to also, and I think it was the member from East End who looked at the number of gas stations in the country. Sometimes dirty little words like moratoriums are what governments have to do to ensure that our people are better off. If we change the way we do our duties as well, Mr. Speaker, I think, or we charge our duties, I think that we could go a longer way to helping our people. Instead of an import duty tariff on fuel, move it from a gallon rate to a percentage of price. And then link that to things like the Platts report so that we can verify. Somebody in government, and I'm hoping that it's the new off-reg, is that how you say it? Because I'm not up on my jargon, but I've been reliably informed by the minister it's off-reg. Somebody's job should be to just monitor those prices, monitor those prices, monitor those prices. Not the whole job. No, I said somebody at that regulatory body. Exactly. Because again, information is key. And this house can help the minister with this good first step. It's time we look at antitrust legislation in this country. Not in this law, but in its totality. Anti-competitive or anti-competition legislation. Speaker, when I was doing my research, I looked at different models, especially ones that affect affect small island states. And we can look at CARICOM for assistance. And like I said, when I was there in January, there were people there looking at how to track regional information and to supply information. That's one way. Or when I was doing my research, I looked at the New Zealand model, and I think that is indicative of something that we could aspire to be, because they are an isolated nation to a certain degree, and the way that they track the prices and how they deal with the gas companies, I think was very unique and something that is worth looking at. I'm not going to get in here, Mr. Speaker, and talk about how to do it, because I'll be the first to admit I know nothing about nothing. I just have in my gut the same feeling I know my constituents have, and that is that we're not getting the fairest price when we go to the pumps. And they say 1,000 lemmings can't be wrong, but I think in this case, they're absolutely right. And we don't have to go over the cliff with them to try to correct this. So I'd like to commend the minister for putting together, I think, the legislation, the right people to take it forward initially. And I hope that they use, or they will use, people like us as representatives of their people to at least gauge some of the concerns, the aspirations, the wants, the hopes, and the effects on the man on the street, so that we can better inform them when they're doing their things like looking at applying formulas and getting data sources and all of that, and add the human element into that, Mr. Speaker, because we are here to represent our people. We're tasked with doing it in the best way we know how, and part of that is working hand in hand with the government, the minister, the off-reg, to try to get the best possible outcome for our people. Because it matters not only to them individually, it matters to all of us collectively. And as a government, it should be priority number one. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Call on the Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the bill, Mr. Speaker, because as many have said, it gives an opportunity for the government, and the government being an institution, not us as a group of people, the government to perhaps get some opportunity to regulate the fuel sector better than it has been doing. And there's much that has been said with which I agree. But Mr. Speaker, the important aspects of this legislation is, and I'm going to look at several of the clauses. Clause 3, subsection 2. Clause 3, subclause 2, sorry. The objectives and purposes referred to in subsection 1 are as follows: to ensure proper, adequate, and continuous supply of fuel. Mr. Speaker, in doing that, this government, other governments, has to be careful that we don't go too far. Whilst our desire is that we obtain fair and reasonable prices, if you go too far, Mr. Speaker, you can also kill a profit motive, which becomes a disincentive to businesses operating properly and efficient. And I'm going to go on to explain so that no one thinks I'm defending the fuel suppliers, because of course, as absolutely, as other members have said, we all feel it. We all feel it. I wish you'd develop your vocabulary. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, Mr. Speaker, I retract that, Mr. Speaker, because yeah, it wasn't appropriate for me to say that. So my apologies to you as a colleague. Mr. Speaker, a little humor for the moment, but nonetheless. Mr. Speaker, the point being, we are making a first step. It has to be a responsible first step. And despite the fact that members would want to see it go further, I think it's necessary that we take the first step and see what is necessary thereafter. And then we can be justified in exercising the nuclear option. Mr. Speaker, many countries have resources that are available to them, but because of overregulation, the cost is significantly higher than it should be. Now, we are about to regulate this fuel industry. But what we have to ensure is that whilst we want to ensure that we prevent the collusion and price fixing, if there is such a thing going on, I have no reason to believe that there is or that there isn't. I don't have any way of knowing. Mr. Speaker, the important thing is everyone will establish a business or invest in a business to make a profit. What we have to ensure is that the profit is not more than reasonable. We can't expect the business to survive and make the necessary investments for growth and development and to continue to improve the infrastructure and equipment and meet the safety standards if the profit motive is taken away from them. So, Mr. Speaker, promote fair competition and provide consumer protection. I think within time, the Office for Utility Regulation and Competition, the Utility Regulation and Competition Office, that's the name. I should have just said the ERCO. I think given time, it will prove the benefit of its cost and establishment. We will have time to improve the legislation if we need to, and we would then be justified in doing so if we needed to. So, Mr. Speaker, I would just caution that if we want businesses to continue to provide employment, we have to be careful as to how much we stifle their ability to make a reasonable profit. We have to ensure that what we do guarantees them to make a reasonable profit, but that we don't try to go too far, that they make just enough to survive and not enough to continue with their development and infrastructure plans and their requirements to meet safety regulations. Mr. Speaker, as I've said, several members said several things with which I agree with respect to the fact that fuel affects, the price of fuel affects everything throughout the economy. It's pervasive, Mr. Speaker. From shipping, nothing gets here without incurring some fuel cost, whether it comes by airline or by ship over the sea. Trucking, once it gets to the dock, it has to be trucked somewhere. Once it gets to Cayman Airways or whatever cargo flight, it has to be trucked somewhere. Both the ships and the trucks use fuel. Once it gets to the commercial or the residential place of its destination, it then incurs additional costs with respect to electricity. There's a famous question that is often asked within this local economy. I think it's been answered by now, but I'll pose it. Why does a gallon of milk cost more than a gallon of gas? And it's a simple reason. Because you refrigerate the milk from production to consumption. And all of that requires electricity and fuel required to create electricity. So the cost is higher. Not to mention other factors such as spoilage and all those things. So, Mr. Speaker, the fifth, I think it was the fifth member for Georgetown, or the fourth member for Bordentown, they both made very good points. If the cost of fuel is too high, it will adversely affect prices. Mr. Speaker, something else is also important. If the cost of fuel is too high, it also prohibits other investments in the country, which would then, of course, stifle growth and development. So it is absolutely necessary that the government find that balance between protecting consumers and ensuring a fair and reasonable profit for the fuel suppliers. And I'm going to continue to say that, Mr. Speaker, because that is the crux of this legislation. You can strip away all the other words, but the purpose of this legislation really and truly is to provide consumer protection and to ensure a fair and reasonable profit for those businesses that have invested in the business of supplying fuels. Mr. Speaker, there are other things that the government might look at some stage, but with respect to this piece of legislation, caution is the order for the day. The government, and I'm going to say this without fear of offending anybody because everyone in the country says this, the government is not in the business of supplying fuels. We do a bad enough job with the fuel at the Department of Vehicle and Equipment Services. I remember the gas boy scandal. The government is not in the business of supplying fuels, and we should not ever attempt to do so. Now, take it a logical step further. If we overregulate and those who are currently in the market decide it is no longer profitable for them to do so, they have two choices. continue to struggle on at profits, if they are making profits at that stage, continue to struggle on without sufficient profits to maintain their infrastructure, both for development and safety aspects, or close up shop and go. Now, the two alternatives after the two options after they've closed up shop and gone. One, the government gets into fuel supply to ensure that there's a, as the law says, to ensure that there's a proper, adequate, and continuous supply of fuel. Possibility one, the government gets into supplying fuel. You just run the other supplier or the suppliers out of the market. You overregulated. I've just established, and it's a well-known fact, the government will not be an efficient supplier of fuels. Possibility number two, someone else enters the market to fill the void that has been created by the departure of the existing market players or suppliers. When the new entrant comes, they will negotiate with the government. They now have the government between a rock and a hard place because the government is not the most efficient. Therefore, with inefficiencies, the prices go up. Or if the price doesn't go up, the supply remains constant or may even decline. So they come to negotiate with the government, and it becomes a well-known fact that the government isn't doing a very good job. Who's in a stronger position then? The government, who created the dilemma that they're in, or the newcomer, who recognizes that the country needs the help? What are they going to then negotiate? Aren't they going to negotiate exemptions and amendments to legislation, as we've seen happen in this country from time to time? When you create situations where you then become dependent on someone else to come in and rescue you, you find yourself between a rock and a hard place where the laws that you had written to protect the people no longer have the teeth and the effectiveness that you thought that it would have. So it's important that we take steps, but we take those steps cautiously to ensure that you don't go far or further than you really want to go to achieve the objective, which is a fair and reasonable profit and consumer protection. Now, Mr. Speaker, as Minister for Finance, I have one overriding objective that I do to the best of my ability. Sometimes it means that I have to oppose or object to something that someone says, and it's not done personally. It is just because that is how things happen. Someone says something, it sounds good, but if not explained as to the weaknesses of it, it then becomes a good idea, and everyone else runs with it. Mr. Speaker, I've heard in this House for the last 4 years that we should take the duty off the quantity of fuel and put it on the price of fuel. The member from Northside mentions it frequently. The fifth member from Georgetown just mentioned it. Mr. Speaker, if you adopt that approach, we only have to look at the last 18 months to 2 years to see that with that approach, the country's revenue would have declined because the price on the global market declined. So if your revenue is tied to the price that is for which it's being bought, and when it lands here, it becomes a CIF price, the cost, insurance, and freight. So what is proposed is that the revenue should then be based on the cost, insurance, and freight per gallon. So either way, Mr. Speaker, if you apply your revenue to the cost, insurance, and freight per gallon, when the global market prices fall, the country's revenue falls. If the global market price rises, the country's revenue will rise. But either way, with a fall or with a decrease or an increase, that portion of the government's revenue will still be passed on to the consumer. That will not be absorbed. All that would happen is that you would lose the predictability of the government's revenue. In the last 18 months to 2 years, we saw the price fall, but what we saw was a continuous increase in the volume of fuel imported. Mr. Speaker, the benefit of that, you are better able to predict your revenue because you've seen that volume increase year after year with a growing population, even though the price per gallon at cost, insurance, and freight declined. That predictability, Mr. Speaker, does not create an adverse situation for the consumer. As I've said before, if you took it and you applied the revenue to the cost, insurance, and freight, if it rises or falls, the supplier will still pass on that cost to the consumer. As it is now, it is based on the volume. The cost is passed on to the consumer, but the benefit of that being on the volume is that the country is better able to predict its revenues on an annual basis. And having predictable revenues then enables the country and the government to know what programs, policies, objectives, services they can continue to provide without being surprised when they're trying to develop their budget. So the predictability is a major component, a major factor in maintaining a stable government and country because of the finances. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't pretend to be an expert in fuels. I didn't work anywhere where they used fuel in large quantities or anything of that sort. I never worked at a gas station pumping gas. I never did anything other than pump my own gas when I buy it. So I don't pretend to understand the fuel market, but I do have some knowledge and understanding of what happens when you transfer costs from government to supplier and how that is then transferred from supplier to consumer. I do have some understanding as to predictability in revenues and the benefit of that. And I do have some understanding as to what is best with respect to protecting the consumer and ensuring a fair and reasonable profit. Companies do not go out of business because they're not making a profit. Sorry, companies do not go to business because they're making a profit. They go to business because they're not making a profit. Companies will sometimes, for whatever reason, cease to meet their obligations under legislation with respect to maintenance of equipment and upholding security standards for the protection of workers and the general public. But that becomes more difficult for them to do when you take away their profits from them. There are many things, Mr. Speaker, that people can do for themselves to help mitigate or even minimize the impact of fuel on their lives. The fifth elected member for Georgetown spoke several times about renewable energy. The Minister for Planning, Lands, Agriculture, Housing, and Infrastructure just last week introduced the renewable energy policy. Mr. Speaker, today there are affordable electric cars. There are affordable propane appliances. There are many ways in which there are also affordable, attractive, reliable, efficient, small engine, low fuel consumption cars. There are many things an individual can do to help reduce the impact of the fuel prices on their cost of living and their daily lives. The government can do so much, and I think the fourth elected member from Bordentown made that point very well. The government can do so much and no more, and it shouldn't be expected that the government is capable of doing everything. There are many things the government can do, but many times doing too much does more harm than good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We'll now take a 10-minute break, please.